This has sort of an open peril agreement for the buildings and a named peril agreement for the property. As an aside, one thing you might notice on the HO2 and HO3 form on this slide is they have broad form and special form. If you're ever dealing with property insurance policies, you're going to see basic, broad, and special forms referenced quite a bit. These are very common peril agreements. Anytime you see special form, that typically refers to some form of open peril agreement, and the basic and broad form are some sort of named peril agreement that lists, usually 11 to 13 relatively common perils. The next slide then lists policies that are oftentimes used for non-owners. So that is to say a renter or a condominium unit owner that owns the unit but not the full building itself. And again, these are just a couple examples of the type of policies and the names of the policies that are often offered by most insurers. All right, well that wraps up our homeowners discussion. We'll now turn our attention to a discussion of the auto policy and specifically the personal auto policy. We're going to see that there are many similarities between the homeowners and auto policy. That is, much like the homeowners policy, the personal auto policy, or the PAP, which we often say, will provide coverage not only for the property, that is the car in this case, but also the liability arising out of the operation of that vehicle. Okay, and this is where we had a slide up front that was misplaced. I'm going to skip back to that real quick. There we go. So the four primary coverages in the auto policy, again conveniently named A, B, C, and D, are the liability coverage, medical payments. Again, both of these are going to be very similar to what we saw in the homeowners policy. Cover C is going to be a little bit, or Part C is going to be a little bit unique. That is the uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. And then Part D is going to be akin to our dwelling coverage for the homeowners. It's going to be the physical damage, property damage component for the automobile itself. We're also going to discuss what happens in no-fault states. So the way the insurance policy is set up in a no-fault state adds to sort of other coverage, this other endorsement called the personal injury protection, or the PIP. And we'll talk about that as we get there. All right, so I'm going to skip back to our auto policy. We should be okay for now. Part A in the liability policy provides coverage that most drivers in at-fault states, or tort states as you might refer to them as, are required to buy. So in most tort states, you're required to buy some sort of minimum liability coverage, or some states do allow you to prove that you are financially able to cover the claims. But most people find it easier just to meet this legal requirement with the standard liability coverage in a PAP. And in fact, this Part A is exactly that minimum coverage that is needed to satisfy most states' auto liability insurance requirement. We'll point out that this coverage will provide coverage to the owner of the car as well as to other people that drive the car. So as you let other individuals borrow your car, you can realize that your coverage will still be in place. As you drive other cars, you should realize that their insurance is in place first, though if necessary, yours will also come, and we would call that an excess coverage. But in general, the insurance does cover the car, covers the driver, regardless of which actual car they're driving at the time. The exception to this is if it's a car provided by work or a car used in an employment context. Those are usually covered under a commercial auto policy but any sort of personal use of the automobile will be covered by this liability coverage. And again, we'll point out that much like the homeowner's liability coverage, what we're talking about here is third-party claims. Right? So this liability coverage is not protecting the driver of the car for their own injuries and their own damage to the car, but rather any issues that the driver becomes liable for as a result of operating the car. And again, they must be found legally liable, so there has to be some sort of legal responsibility before the insurance will attach. The Part B, the second coverage for in the auto policy, is the medical payments coverage. Much like we saw in the homeowner's policy, this provides a relatively modest amount of coverage. Again, $5,000 is not uncommon for relatively minor medical expenses. The difference here between the medical payments and the auto coverage, as well as from the homeowner's policy, is that this actually will cover the insured. So if you're injured in the car or you're hit by a car as a pedestrian, something of this in this vein, the medical payments will actually provide coverage to the insured. Again, it's a relatively modest amount of insurance. It's done on a no-fault basis. The idea is, again, to try to minimize legal costs, and if there's a minor issue, just to handle it straight away. So if those two we saw in the homeowner's policy, what we didn't see in the homeowner's policy, because there was no need, is this notion of uninsured motorist. And so in fact, Part C has what we refer to as uninsured motorist coverage, as well as another part, the underinsured motorist. These will be two separate things, so we'll make sure we make the distinction between those two. But the uninsured motorist coverage basically acts as the liability coverage for the driver if the at-fault party did not have insurance. So imagine you're driving your car and you're fully insured and someone hits you and they don't have insurance. Well, if you have this Part C, uninsured motorist coverage, then your uninsured motorist coverage will act as if the other driver had liability coverage, pay you for your injuries, pay you for your, in some states, your property damage, and so forth. This is not just for those accidents where there's an uninsured motorist. Indeed, it could be the case that you don't know who hit you. So if you've come back from the mall and find that someone has hit your car, this, oftentimes they refer to this as a hit and run situation. This also is covered under the uninsured motorist coverage, as well as any driver whose insurance company is insolvent. If the insurance company, if the driver has insurance but the insurance company isn't paying because they're out of business, then your uninsured motorist coverage will also kick in here. It's important to lastly note that the uninsured motorist that hits you must be liable, right? So it must have been their fault before your uninsured motorist will kick in. Otherwise, if it's your fault, then you'll have to claim under your property damage or your health care or something like this for your losses. The other part of the Part C is the underinsured motorist coverage. This is very similar in spirit to the uninsured motorist, but this applies when the at-fault party simply doesn't have enough insurance. So you can imagine that in many situations, the drivers are buying the minimum amount of insurance that's required by the state. And in the situations where that minimum amount of insurance is not sufficient to cover the loss that they cause, you as a driver might find yourself out of luck. The underinsured motorist coverage sort of meets that gap, covers that gap. So if there's any difference between your losses and what the other motorist, the at-fault motorist, has in terms of insurance, then the underinsured motorist coverage will provide coverage there. Again, we'll point out that some states allow property damage to be covered under this, some don't. And again, the underinsured motorist has to be at fault. It means they have to have been legally liable for the accident. I'm sorry, I didn't get you to that side. And that's what we just talked about.